The machine gun nest overlooked the hedgerow-lined fields of Normandy, its steel barrel gleaming in the pale moonlight of June 5, 1944. Obergefreiter Klaus Brenner adjusted his field glasses and chuckled at the intelligence briefing pinned to the concrete wall beside him. Another Allied warning about possible airborne infiltration. The metallic taste of fear should have filled his mouth, but instead, he savored the bitter irony of coffee grounds mixed with chicory. The fate of Hitler's Atlantic Wall, and perhaps the entire war, hung on whether these coastal defenders could repel the inevitable Allied invasion. For 2 years, German officers had dismissed Allied paratroopers as little more than propaganda stunts. Men who fall from the sky like locusts, scoffed General Major Wilhelm Falley, commander of the 915th Grenadier Regiment, during a staff meeting in May 1944. The comparison wasn't entirely unfair. Early Allied airborne operations had been costly disasters. Operation Market Garden the previous year had seen British paratroopers slaughtered at Arnhem, their bodies scattered across Dutch farmland like broken dolls. German propaganda films showed captured Allied airmen dangling helplessly from telephone wires, easy targets for Wehrmacht marksmen. But the Americans possessed something the Germans hadn't fully grasped: industrial audacity on an incomprehensible scale. While Brenner maintained his watch from Bunker 729, 300 miles away in England, 13,000 American paratroopers blackened their faces with burnt cork and checked their equipment one final time. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions represented the largest night combat drop in military history. Each soldier carried 20 to 30 kilograms of equipment: rifles, ammunition, grenades, radios, rations, and enough supplies to survive behind enemy lines for days. Their C-47 Dakota aircraft engines hummed across dozens of airfields, a mechanical symphony of American manufacturing might. German intelligence had intercepted Allied communications, hinting at airborne operations, but the scale remained unimaginable. How could any military organization coordinate the simultaneous drop of thousands of soldiers in darkness? The logistics alone seemed impossible. Hundreds of aircraft flying in formation through defended airspace, navigating by stars and compass bearings, releasing their human cargo with split-second timing across multiple drop zones. The answer lay in American organizational capacity that German commanders couldn't comprehend. At Sainte-Mère-Église, the church bells chimed midnight as Hauptmann Friedrich von der Heydete reviewed his defensive positions. The veteran paratrooper, ironically, one of Germany's most experienced airborne commanders, had spent months fortifying Normandy's interior against the theoretical possibility of Allied drops. His 606th Parachute Regiment occupied strategic crossroads and bridges, their MG-42 machine guns positioned to create interlocking fields of fire across the Bocage countryside. Von der Heydete understood airborne warfare better than most Wehrmacht officers, having led successful German paratroop operations in Crete 3 years earlier. Yet even he underestimated Allied capabilities. "Airborne soldiers are elite troops," he wrote in his diary that spring, "but they are also isolated troops, cut off from supplies, scattered by navigation errors, vulnerable to concentrated fire from prepared positions. The Americans lack the experience for large-scale night operations." German confidence wasn't entirely misplaced. The Atlantic Wall bristled with concrete bunkers, trenches, and machine gun nests constructed since 1942. The 709th Infantry Division, though composed largely of older conscripts unfit for frontline service, occupied fortified positions throughout the coastal region. Artillery pieces zeroed in on likely landing zones, telephone networks connected every strongpoint to divisional headquarters. What the Germans didn't anticipate was American willingness to accept catastrophic losses in exchange for strategic surprise. Diary excerpt, Gefreiter Hans Müller, 709th Infantry Division, June 5th. Another quiet night in Fortress Europe. The Tommies and Armies Americans rattle their sabers across the Channel, but they know what awaits them here. Let them come. We are ready. The sentiment reflected widespread German confidence in their defensive preparations. Allied propaganda leaflets dropped over Normandy had warned of impending airborne attacks, but Wehrmacht soldiers treated these as psychological warfare rather than tactical intelligence. After all, what sane military commander would sacrifice elite troops in scattered night drops against prepared defenses? American commanders understood the risks. Airborne casualties were projected at 30%. Acceptable losses for securing the flanks of the massive amphibious assault planned for dawn. The 82nd Airborne's mission included capturing Sainte-Mère-Église and securing strategic crossroads to prevent German reinforcements from reaching the beaches. The 101st Airborne aimed to seize bridges and roadways behind Utah Beach, creating a protective corridor for the seaborne invasion. By June 5th, Pathfinder teams had already infiltrated Normandy, marking drop zones with radio beacons and colored lights. These advanced scouts operated in radio silence, knowing that capture meant execution as spies rather than treatment as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. Their success would determine whether thousands of paratroopers landed in designated fields or scattered across miles of enemy-held territory. The night air carried the scent of wet earth and blooming hedgerows as German sentries maintained their vigil. In bunkers and farmhouses across Normandy, Wehrmacht soldiers cleaned their weapons, wrote letters home, and played cards by candlelight. The same routine they had followed for months, confident in their defensive superiority. They never noticed the growing rumble of aircraft engines approaching from across the English Channel. Death was coming from above, but the Germans weren't the only ones underestimating their enemies. As C-47 transports crossed the French coast at 1,200 feet, carrying their human cargo toward history's most audacious gamble, American paratroopers had no idea they were about to transform warfare itself. Would these men who fall from the sky prove German mockery correct, or would they rewrite the rules of modern combat? The church bells of Sainte-Mère-Église continued their midnight chime, counting down the final moments before everything changed. The first parachute blossomed against the star-filled sky at 15 minutes past midnight, June 6, 1944. A white silk flower opening in the darkness above Normandy. The rumble of 243 C-47 Dakota engines shattered the night silence like thunder rolling across the French countryside, while the acrid smell of aviation fuel mixed with the sweet scent of apple blossoms in the Norman orchards below. The success or failure of Operation Overlord now depended on whether scattered paratroopers could hold their objectives until dawn brought the seaborne invasion. Private First Class James Flanagan of the 101st Airborne felt his static line jerk taut as he tumbled from the aircraft's doorway. The ground rushed toward him through wisps of cloud and tracer fire, a patchwork of hedgerow-divided fields that looked nothing like the sand tables back in England. His parachute snapped open with a bone-jarring shock, and suddenly the chaos above gave way to an eerie silence broken only by the distant stutter of German machine guns and the soft whisper of silk canopies descending through the darkness. Across 37 square miles of Norman countryside, American paratroopers were landing everywhere except where they were supposed to. Navigation proved catastrophically difficult in the overcast conditions. cloud cover obscured the stars that pilots used for celestial navigation, while German anti-aircraft fire forced many transport aircraft off their planned routes. Some planes released their human cargo 15 miles from designated drop zones. Others flew too fast, scattering entire sticks of paratroopers across miles of enemy territory. The Pathfinder teams that had marked landing zones found their carefully placed beacons useless as aircraft, arrived minutes late and miles off course. The result was tactical disaster that would somehow become strategic triumph. Obergefreiter Klaus Brenner was drinking ersatz coffee in his bunker when the first parachutes appeared overhead. He blinked twice, certain his eyes were playing tricks in the moonlight. Then more shapes materialized, dozens, then hundreds of white silk canopies drifting down like autumn leaves. His hands trembled as he reached for the field telephone to alert headquarters, but the line was dead. Unknown to Brenner, American paratroopers had already cut telephone cables throughout the region, severing communications between German strongpoints. Radio transmission intercepted by German 84th Corps. 47 hours. Fallschirmjäger über Sainte-Mère-Église. Paratroopers over Sainte-Mère-Église. Hundreds of them. Request immediate. Transmission cuts to static. The scale of the operation overwhelmed German defensive preparations. Wehrmacht doctrine assumed airborne forces would consist of company-sized units, perhaps 200 men maximum, dropped at specific tactical objectives. The simultaneous arrival of 13,000 paratroopers across dozens of drop zones shattered every assumption about Allied capabilities. German commanders found themselves fighting shadow battles against an enemy that seemed to materialize from the night itself. For the Americans, the scattered drops created unexpected advantages. Instead of concentrated forces attacking predetermined objectives, small groups of paratroopers appeared throughout German-held territory. Every farmhouse, every crossroads, every bridge suddenly became a potential battlefield. Wehrmacht units found themselves surrounded, cut off, or under attack from directions their defensive plans hadn't considered. But the human cost was immediate and brutal. Sergeant Robert Murphy of the 82nd Airborne landed in a flooded field behind Sainte-Mère-Église, his equipment harness dragging him underwater as he struggled to cut away his parachute lines. The Norman bocage, those hedgerow-lined fields that gave the countryside its characteristic appearance, became death traps for descending paratroopers. Ancient stone walls and thick vegetation caught parachutes like spider webs, leaving soldiers dangling helplessly as German patrol units closed in. Private John Steele's experience at Sainte-Mère-Église became legendary, though his night was anything but heroic. His parachute snagged on the church steeple just as German soldiers emerged from buildings below, drawn by the sound of aircraft engines and burning buildings. For 2 hours, Steele hung motionless against the stone tower, playing dead while Wehrmacht troops searched for other paratroopers in the streets below. The medieval church bells that had chimed midnight now tolled a death knell for German confidence in their defensive positions. Diary entry, Hauptmann Friedrich von der Heydte, June 6th. They fall like rain from the sky. Impossible to believe men are so bold. My positions are surrounded by small groups, each fighting with desperate courage. Radio contact lost with half my companies. German soldiers discovered that their mockery of airborne troops had been based on fundamental misunderstanding. These weren't the scattered, poorly equipped paratroopers of early war propaganda films. American Airborne Divisions represented elite infantry trained for exactly this type of operation. Each soldier carried enough ammunition for sustained combat, rations for 3 days, and specialized equipment for sabotage and communications. The darkness that complicated American navigation also worked against German defenders. Wehrmacht units found themselves firing at shadows, uncertain whether rustling hedgerows concealed advancing paratroopers or simply cattle disturbed by the aircraft noise. The psychological impact was devastating. Every farm building, every tree line, every stone wall might conceal enemy soldiers. French civilians caught between the opposing forces faced impossible choices. In the village of Angoville-au-Plain, Madame Marguerite Leclerc hid 6 wounded American paratroopers in her barn while German patrols searched neighboring farms. She brought them water and bread, knowing that discovery meant execution for collaborating with enemy soldiers. Would you have shown such courage, or would fear have overwhelmed compassion in those deadly pre-dawn hours? By 2 o'clock that morning, scattered paratroopers began linking up according to their training. The distinctive metal cricket calls issued to American airborne units echoed across Norman fields as small groups coalesced into fighting units. The planned tactical objectives, bridges, crossroads, artillery positions, might have been missed, but the strategic goal was succeeding beyond expectations. Paradise lost. German defensive coordination collapsed as communications failed and scattered attacks materialized throughout their rear areas. The Wehrmacht had prepared for a conventional assault against fixed positions, not for asymmetric warfare by small units operating behind their lines. Ammunition supplies disappeared as paratroopers raided German depots. Artillery positions fell silent as their crews fled or were eliminated by American raiders. General Major Wilhelm Falle, who had mocked Allied airborne capabilities just weeks earlier, found himself trapped in his own headquarters as American paratroopers surrounded the building. His staff car, racing toward the coast to coordinate anti-invasion defenses, drove directly into a 101st Airborne roadblock. The general who had called paratroopers locusts died in a ditch beside a Norman farmhouse, killed by the very soldiers he had dismissed as ineffective. Dawn was still hours away, but already the German defensive system was fracturing under pressure from an enemy that wasn't supposed to exist in such numbers. Wehrmacht units designed to repel seaborne assault found themselves fighting desperate battles against airborne infiltrators miles from the coast. But the real test was yet to come. When first light revealed the true scale of Allied amphibious power assembling offshore, would these scattered paratroopers be able to prevent German reinforcements from reaching the beaches? The first gray light of June 6th filtered through the smoke-shrouded hedgerows of Normandy at 5:47 that morning, revealing a landscape transformed by 6 hours of scattered warfare. The metallic tang of cordite hung in the damp air, mixing with the earthy smell of overturned soil and the copper scent of blood seeping into Norman farmland. By dawn, the German defensive system that had taken 2 years to construct was crumbling under pressure from an enemy that had materialized from darkness itself. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Vandervoort of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment crouched behind a stone wall 3 miles inland from Utah Beach, surveying terrain that bore no resemblance to the intelligence maps studied in England. His ankle, broken during a hard landing in a hedgerow-lined field, throbbed with each movement, but the tactical situation demanded immediate action. Through his field glasses, he counted 17 separate groups of American paratroopers converging on the crossroads at Neuville-au-Plain. Scattered drops had become concentrated fighting power. The transformation was occurring across dozens of similar positions throughout the Norman countryside. What German commanders had dismissed as tactical suicide was revealing itself as strategic genius. The scattered nature of the airborne assault, initially seen as catastrophic navigation failure, had created a web of small unit actions that paralyzed Wehrmacht defensive coordination. Every German strongpoint found itself isolated, surrounded, or under attack from unexpected directions. Radio communications, already disrupted by cut telephone lines, collapsed entirely as American paratroopers systematically eliminated command posts and signal installations. Major General Matthew Ridgway, commanding the 82nd Airborne Division, later described the night's operations. "We achieved tactical dispersion through navigational accident, but strategic concentration through superior training and initiative. Every crossroads, every bridge, every German position became a separate battlefield where individual American soldiers made decisions that affected the entire invasion." The German response revealed fatal flaws in Wehrmacht defensive doctrine. General Lieutenant Karl Wilhelm von Schlieben, commanding the 909th Corps responsible for Normandy's coastal defense, found himself fighting a war for which his forces had never trained. His carefully prepared positions faced seaward, designed to repel amphibious assault with interlocking fields of artillery fire. The sudden appearance of enemy forces throughout his rear areas required immediate redeployment of reserves that were supposed to counterattack against beachhead landings. Radio intercept, German 84th Corps Headquarters, 06:15 hours. Enemy paratroopers in company strength at grid, reference 294587. Artillery support requested immediately. Wait, now reporting enemy contact at 301-595 and 287-6009. How many of them are there? By 6:30 that morning, German artillery units faced impossible targeting decisions. Allied naval gunfire from offshore battleships demanded immediate attention, but American paratroopers threatened artillery positions from behind. Ammunition supplies, stockpiled for defensive bombardment of invasion beaches, were being consumed in scattered engagements miles from the coast. The bocage countryside that had complicated American drops now worked against German defenders. Ancient stone walls and thick hedgerows that provided excellent defensive positions also fragmented Wehrmacht units into isolated strongpoints. German doctrine emphasized centralized command and coordinated movement, concepts that became impossible when every field contained potential enemy positions. Sergeant First Class Leonard Funk of the 508th Parachute Infantry discovered a German ammunition depot hidden in a Norman farmhouse basement. The cache contained enough artillery shells to supply a battery for 2 weeks, shells that would never reach German guns defending the beaches. Similar discoveries occurred throughout the drop zones as paratroopers systematically disrupted supply lines that had taken months to establish. But the real revelation came when dawn exposed the Allied armada offshore. Men fell from heaven. Private Robert Cole, wounded during his landing near Sainte-Mère-Église, crawled to a hedgerow crest and witnessed a sight that defied comprehension. The English Channel stretched to the horizon, covered with more ships than existed in his vocabulary to describe. Landing craft, destroyers, cruisers, battleships, and transport vessels formed geometric patterns across miles of gray water. Smoke from naval bombardment created an artificial thunderstorm that shook the earth beneath his body. German defenders experienced similar revelations. Hauptmann Werner Kortenhaus, commanding a coastal artillery battery near Poupeville, watched through his periscope as Allied vessels materialized from pre-dawn darkness. His battery's 4 guns, positioned to devastate landing craft approaching the beaches, had expended half their ammunition fighting American paratroopers who had attacked from behind during the night. The psychological impact on Wehrmacht morale was devastating. Soldiers who had spent 2 years constructing the Atlantic Wall suddenly realized their defensive preparations were inadequate. The Americans hadn't simply launched an amphibious assault. They had demonstrated industrial and organizational capacity that rendered German defensive concepts obsolete. French civilians trapped between opposing forces provided the most poignant testimony to the night's transformation. Marie Dubois, a farmer's wife from Ongoville-au-Plain, recorded in her diary, "The Americans who fell from the sky were just boys, most of them younger than my own son. But they moved with purpose, spoke in confident whispers, shared their chocolate with our children. These were not desperate men thrown into hopeless battle. These were professionals executing a plan." Would you have recognized the difference between desperation and confidence in those chaotic dawn hours? The success of individual paratrooper actions accumulated into strategic advantage. Bridge demolitions prevented German armor from reaching the beaches. Cut telephone lines disrupted defensive coordination. Eliminated command posts decapitated local resistance. Roadblocks channeled German reinforcements into killing zones prepared by follow-up glider landings. At 0630 hours, the first Waco CG-4A gliders began landing behind enemy lines, carrying heavy equipment that transformed scattered paratroopers into mechanized infantry. Jeeps, artillery pieces, medical supplies, and communications equipment arrived precisely where needed. A logistics feat that German observers found incomprehensible. How could any military organization coordinate such precise delivery of material across dozens of landing zones while under fire? By 7 o'clock that morning, American paratroopers controlled 17 of their 23 primary objectives. More importantly, they had achieved their strategic mission, preventing German reinforcements from reaching the invasion beaches during the critical first hours of the assault. Wehrmacht reserves that should have been counterattacking against seaborne landings were instead fighting desperate defensive battles against airborne infiltrators. The transformation was complete. German mockery had become German desperation. Allied audacity had become Allied advantage. The men who had fallen from the sky like locusts were now reshaping the battlefield according to American strategic vision. But the ultimate test remained ahead. Could these scattered victories be consolidated into permanent territorial gains before German reinforcements arrived from the interior? The answer would determine whether D-Day succeeded or failed, whether the liberation of Europe began in Norman fields or ended in Norman graveyards. By noon on June 6, 1944, the smoke-blackened towers of Sainte-Mère-Église church bore witness to a fundamental transformation in modern warfare. The acrid smell of burned cordite mixed with the sweet scent of crushed apple blossoms as American paratroopers consolidated positions that German commanders had declared impossible to hold. The airborne assault that Wehrmacht officers had mocked as tactical suicide had become the blueprint for military operations that would reshape warfare for generations. Colonel James Gavin of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment stood among the rubble of a German command post near La Fière Bridge, reading intercepted Wehrmacht communications that revealed the scope of defensive collapse. 12 hours. Scattered American paratroopers had accomplished what conventional ground assault would have required weeks to achieve: the systematic destruction of German defensive coordination across 37 square miles of strategic territory. The numbers told a story that German military doctrine couldn't explain. 13,000 American paratroopers, dropped in scattered groups across enemy-held territory, had eliminated over 200 German strongpoints, severed 43 telephone cable networks, and prevented the movement of an entire Wehrmacht division toward the invasion beaches. The tactical dispersion that had seemed catastrophic at midnight had become strategic concentration by dawn. Intelligence report: German 7th Army Headquarters, 14:30 hours. Airborne landings achieved complete tactical surprise. Enemy forces now control all major road junctions between coast and interior. reinforcement of beach defenses impossible without major redeployment from other sectors. General Lieutenant Dietrich Kreis, commanding the 352nd Infantry Division, found himself fighting a war that violated every principle of defensive warfare he had learned during 25 years of military service. His carefully constructed battle plans assumed enemy forces would approach from predictable directions, across beaches, along roads, through designated attack corridors. The simultaneous appearance of American forces throughout his rear areas rendered those plans useless. German officers who had dismissed airborne troops as men falling like locusts now faced the humiliating reality that these same soldiers controlled terrain the Wehrmacht considered impregnable. Bridge positions that had taken months to fortify fell to paratrooper assault teams in hours. Artillery batteries positioned to dominate invasion beaches found themselves under attack from directions their guns couldn't traverse. The psychological transformation was even more profound than the tactical defeat. Obergefreiter Hans Richter, captured during the fighting at Chef du Pont, provided American interrogators with insights into German thinking. "We were told your airborne soldiers were desperate men, thrown away by commanders who didn't value their lives. But they fought with precision, used sophisticated equipment, coordinated attacks across impossible distances. These were not desperate men. These were the finest soldiers we had ever encountered." The recognition forced a fundamental revision in German military assessment of American capabilities. Intelligence reports that had described Allied forces as poorly trained and inadequately equipped suddenly seemed laughably inaccurate. If American airborne divisions demonstrated such tactical sophistication, what did that suggest about the massive conventional forces now pouring ashore at Omaha and Utah beaches? Diary entry, Hauptmann Friedrich von der Heydte, June 7th. The Americans have accomplished something we thought impossible: the coordination of large-scale night operations with precision that exceeds our own airborne capabilities. We underestimated not just their courage, but their competence. Von der Heydte's assessment carried particular weight. As Germany's most experienced airborne commander, his recognition of American tactical superiority represented more than professional admiration. It acknowledged the obsolescence of German military doctrine. The technological implications were equally revolutionary. American paratroopers had demonstrated the practical application of industrial capacity to military operations on a scale that German manufacturing couldn't match. The coordination of 243 transport aircraft, delivering troops and equipment with split-second timing across dozens of drop zones, required organizational capabilities that extended far beyond military training. Each C-47 Dakota represented American industrial might that German commanders hadn't fully comprehended. These aircraft, produced at rates of 15 per day during peak production, carried specialized equipment designed specifically for airborne operations. Parachutes manufactured to exacting specifications, radio equipment that functioned reliably under combat conditions, weapons and ammunition precisely calibrated for the weight restrictions of air transport. Victory through vertical envelopment. The strategic implications extended far beyond Normandy. American airborne success on D-Day validated tactical concepts that would dominate military thinking for decades. The ability to project force behind enemy lines, disrupting defensive coordination through simultaneous attacks on multiple objectives, became the foundation for modern special operations doctrine. German military analysts, studying captured American equipment and documents, discovered airborne planning that stretched back 18 months before the invasion. Training facilities in the United States had replicated Norman terrain down to individual hedgerows. Paratrooper equipment had been field-tested in similar conditions across multiple climates. Nothing had been left to chance, a level of preparation that German forces, increasingly reliant on improvisation and desperate measures, could no longer match. The human cost of the operation provided sobering context for its strategic success. American airborne casualties approached 25%, over 3,000 killed, wounded, or missing from the initial assault. Yet those losses had prevented German reinforcements from reaching the beaches during the critical first hours when seaborne landings remained vulnerable to concentrated counterattack. French civilians who witnessed the transformation became unwitting historians of warfare evolution. Pierre Caldron, mayor of Sainte-Mère-Église, recorded his observations. The German soldiers who had seemed so confident, so professional during 2 years of occupation, appeared confused and demoralized after the American paratroopers landed. It was as if they realized their entire understanding of warfare had become obsolete overnight. By June 10th, Wehrmacht commanders were requesting detailed intelligence about American airborne capabilities, hoping to understand how such operations might be countered in future battles. The requests revealed the scope of German tactical confusion, experienced officers seeking explanations for military phenomena they couldn't comprehend. The long-term consequences reshaped military education and doctrine worldwide. Staff colleges from Moscow to Tokyo studied the Normandy airborne operations, analyzing how scattered tactical actions had achieved strategic objectives. The concept of vertical envelopment, attacking enemy positions from above and behind, became standard doctrine for military forces that possessed the industrial capacity to implement such operations. American Airborne Divisions, vindicated by their D-Day success, expanded into entire airborne corps capable of independent operations. The 82nd and 101st Airborne would spearhead subsequent operations from Market Garden to the Rhine crossing. Their tactical reputation established during those first chaotic hours in Norman darkness. German military memoirs written after the war consistently acknowledged the revolutionary impact of Allied airborne operations. General Oberst Kurt Student, architect of German airborne doctrine, later wrote, "The Americans achieved what we had only theorized, the practical application of airborne assault on strategic scale. Their success at Normandy demonstrated industrial and organizational superiority that rendered our defensive concepts obsolete." The transformation was complete. Wehrmacht officers who had mocked Allied paratroopers as ineffective propaganda tools were requesting detailed studies of American airborne capabilities. The men who had fallen from Norman skies like locusts had risen as architects of military revolution. In the end, the greatest victory wasn't tactical or strategic. It was conceptual. American paratroopers had proven that industrial democracy could project military power with precision and effectiveness that totalitarian systems couldn't match. The mockery had become admiration, the propaganda had become reality, and the locusts had become legends. The soldiers who jumped into darkness over Normandy had illuminated the future of warfare itself.